So let me say some words about today's speaker, who is Richard Hobbs. And the title, of course, is Big Money Out of Politics. A move to amend Santa Clara County. They're currently working to gather signatures for November 2014 county ballot initiative in support of 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution by eliminating corporate personhood and money as political speech as affirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court in Citizens United, as well as processor and progeny precedent decisions. Move to Amend hopes to build democracy and in corporate rule, the name of its political action committee. Without campaign financial reform, we will never get any serious reforms in the U.S. So Richard Hobbs is the moderator of MTC, SCC, and BDECR, an immigration attorney, former director of the Office of Human Relations of Santa Clara County, and currently executive director of Human Agenda, and will present this program. Let's give him a good hand and welcome him to our...
Thank you very much.
And that's your water, should you want more.
Thank you. Good morning. I have the greatest respect for the humanist community. 1 year, in fact, not that long ago, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, I actually went to the national conferences of the American Humanist Association, the Ethical Cultural Society, and the Unitarian Universalists all in the same year. And what I learned is the importance of focusing on what is reality in terms of our senses and our experience and our science, the importance of non-theistic spirituality, the importance of the separation of church and state, and the importance of accepting the different ways that people find purpose in their lives. What I didn't sense from those national conferences actually was the urgency, the analysis, and the vision of focusing on perhaps what I consider the central issue of our time. It's what we all really seek, and that is, how do we meet the true human needs of the people in the United States and in the world through institutions that are democratic, egalitarian, cooperative, sustainable, and kind. I started working on this issue of a sustainable, human need fulfilling vision 37 years ago. And in fact, 30 years ago, I finished a master's thesis at San Jose State. It's called Human Value. And I'd like to share that vision with you very briefly as a frame for the work of Move to Amend. And of course, as was just mentioned, Move to Amend is a national movement with 160 different affiliates around the country to pass a 28th Amendment to the Constitution, declaring that corporations are not persons and money is not speech. So several decades ago, I started by asking the question, what are our human needs? And using this philosophical category of totality, of looking at the totality of human needs, I started to identify those needs in a number of different ways. And one of the ways was by conducting focus groups with over 50 different organizations or groupings of people, including immigrants, because I was the director of citizenship and immigrant programs in Santa Clara County and was able to actually hear what our human needs are from different immigrant groups around the world, as well as asking, for example, Unitarian Universalist children the same question, and people in Thailand and Mexico City the same question. And so from those 50 gatherings, I was able to develop a list, a one-page list of all of our human needs. It's really not that complicated, folks. We don't have that many concrete human needs. And I asked basically two questions. I said, what does an individual need to survive if that individual is a Robinson Crusoe and alone on that island? And secondly, And that, of course, encompasses both psychological and physiological needs, because that person on that island has to have a purpose to live, or else they're not going to continue living. So it's not just about food or shelter. And then secondly, I asked, in any society, anywhere, at any time, what are those basic requirements for that society or community to reproduce itself? And so from that inquiry and from organizing those human needs into a way that would make sense in terms of a vision for how I try to live my life, and in a way that human beings can have all of their human needs met, basically I concluded that people need to have access to and resources and time to 5 different areas of life. First of all, we all need time and resources to take care of ourselves. Care work. So care work is not only about taking care of ourselves. We're the ones that have to eat right. We're the ones that have to take care of our health. We have a lot of personal responsibility of taking care of ourselves. But care work also obviously encompasses the care of those around us, in our family in particular, but also in our immediate community. And so care work is really essential, that we all contribute to taking care of our family and immediate communities. And there are many different aspects to that I won't go into. The second, and really perhaps the fulcrum to allow everything else to happen, is that we all need, to the extent that we're all able to work, we all need to have access to a living wage job with reduced work hours, producing something of value for society. There's a lot of stuff that we produce that is not of value for society, like Trident missiles, for example. But I won't go there either. But honestly, if we don't reduce our work hours, which has been one of the goals of the European trade union movement, instead of just taking more, like the AFL-CIO, in Europe, they have agreed to take less, but reduce their work hours as part of that productivity dividend. In the United States, we work longer hours than any other country on earth, and we have always chosen basically to have more instead of more time. More things instead of more time. So reduced work hours is critical, because if we don't have reduced work hours, how do we do those other things that make us fully human? The third area is lifelong learning. We need to have access to true and accurate information, which is very difficult these days, and we need to have the time and the resources to continue to learn throughout our lives. The fourth area really has to do with how we govern ourselves, but in every aspect of our life. Every society needs a decision-making structure. They haven't always been the best. If you go to, Germany in the early 1940s, they haven't always been the best. But I think every society does have decision-making structures within every institution, from the family all the way up to the United Nations. We have decision-making structures. And so obviously it would be our goal to have decision-making structures that are democratic, including inside the family, inside our workplace, inside our local government, inside our national government, which I'll talk to about in a little bit because of the real problem around finance right now, and even to the level of the United Nations. And finally, at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs was self-realization. We need time to do those things that give us passion in life, that make us feel fully human, that allow us to do those things that are fun. It could be art, culture, sports, reflection, community service. Whatever those are, that time is really important to allow people to feel and be fully human. Now, what's important in terms of this 5-part vision of care work, of meaningful work with living wage jobs, with reduced work hours, of access to education throughout your life, to democratic institutions, and to self-realization, what's really critical is that there be enough time for everybody to basically participate in those basic things. Silicon Valley is really the poster child of overwork. We have people on one end, like software engineers that are working 60 and 70 hours a week, sometimes 100 hours a week. And do you think they have time to take care of themselves or their family? Do you think they have time for, further learning outside of their job? Do you think they have time for civic engagement in community institutions? Do you think they have time for self-realization? The answer is no, 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 no. On the other hand, we have janitors that I've worked a lot with, immigrant janitors in Santa Clara County, that work 70 hours a week just to pay the rent, only to pay the rent. And so really on both ends of the scale in Silicon Valley, we have a lot of alienated people walking around that really don't have access to meeting some of their fundamental human needs. So I'd like to just make a few comments about this vision. Conclusions. Number one, with respect to care work, it's really important that men participate equally to women. And this has been the topic of, you probably heard of Arlie Hochschild in her book, The Second Shift, who wrote a book about how women are working on average 19 to 23 hours more per week than their husbands because they're taking care of the house, which is completely in a demonstration of inequality inside the household. The second thing, as I mentioned, is reduced work hours is really key. If you're working as many hours as most people do in Silicon Valley, you can't meet your basic human needs. I was in Spain at the Mondragon cooperatives, and I'm actually taking a group of people to the Mondragon cooperatives in 2 months. And in Mondragon, Spain, even the small shop holders in Mondragon, which is the center for the biggest cooperative movement on earth, the shop owners only open their stores 32.5 hours a week. And they say, if you want to buy my goods, you come during these 32.5 hours. And if you don't, goodbye. And so the focus on having enough time to actually live your life is really critical in most European countries. The third thing is that, as I mentioned, we really need to focus on only true human needs versus false needs and wants for a vision. And fourth, I think we could say that when there's a correspondence between meeting the individual needs of a person and social institutions that can actually meet those needs, at that point I could say that we probably are close to a humanist society or a humanistic society. We're far from that because our institutions do not really provide for that. In fact, to get there, we need to have institutions in our society that are democratic, that are egalitarian, that are cooperative, that are sustainable, and that are kind. So what does all this humane vision have to do with corporations, corporate personhood, and money as speech? Well, first of all, I could ask you the question, do you think that corporations are democratic, are egalitarian, are cooperative, are sustainable, are kind? If we use those 5 values, I think we'll find that we have a huge crisis in our country at this point. So I want to talk briefly about the history of corporate personhood, because as you know, the word corporation is not in the U.S. Constitution for a reason. Because our founding fathers were fighting against the British East Indies Company, the largest corporation monopoly on earth at that time. They were fighting against a monopoly corporation. Why would they want to protect corporations in the Constitution? It makes absolutely no sense, and if you read some of the quotes from Jefferson and Madison, you'll see that they feared corporations. And they specifically didn't empower corporations in the Constitution. In the first 100 years, if a corporation, for example, gave money to a political campaign, it was a felony to do so. Corporations had to be chartered by a state for a beneficial purpose, only for a beneficial purpose that was not being met by some other entity in that state. And as part of that beneficial purpose, they were only chartered for 5 or 10 years. Typically about 10 years, and at that point, they had to end the corporation or request a rechartering of their corporation. It was illegal for a corporation to buy more lands, for example, or resources than they needed to do their job. So they couldn't just merge with other corporations. It was illegal for a corporation to buy another corporation, for example. So in, I believe, the 1850s, this issue of chartering corporations, I don't have the exact date, but the issue of chartering corporations actually transformed into allowing what we have today, which is corporations in perpetuity.
1811 in New York.
1811 in New York. Okay, I knew of something else, but that's okay. 1811 in New York. I know that in Madison versus Marbury also there was an important holding. In 1868, you're probably aware that there was a case, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, which was decided absolutely without any reference to corporate personhood. However, the clerk for the Supreme Court Justice at the time, I won't go into names, created a head note that said, corporations are persons under the 14th Amendment. So the railroad barons in particular, for a couple of decades, had been trying to advance this legal theory under the Constitution that actually when the 14th Amendment was passed in 1864, I believe, that at that time the concept of persons didn't refer so much to African Americans or black slaves, but rather to or artificial entities, And so this was pushed forward by the corporate attorneys, especially of the big railroad barons, and finally they got a holding in 1868. Since that day in 1868, the case actually began right here in San Jose. We've had a number of protests, Move to Amend, right in front of the old courthouse at St. James Park. That's where corporate personhood all began, right here in that courthouse in San Jose. Unfortunately, since 1868, we've had a number of holdings by the Supreme Court and appellate courts also that have undermined our human rights and provided those same rights to corporations. And so I'd like to just give an example under each one of the 5 headings that I was talking about with a vision for a better world. First of all, in terms of care work, being able to take care of our health and the health of our children, for example, in a case called Lorillard Tobacco in 2001, the U.S. Supreme Court held that Massachusetts regulations that prohibited tobacco or cigar advertising within 1,000 feet of schools violated the First Amendment rights of the tobacco companies because they have the free speech right to advertise. In terms of reduced work hours and having a living wage, in another Supreme Court case that took place some 80 years ago, it's called Atkins, the Congress had passed a law, and it was signed into law, and it stated that in Washington, D.C., the wages of women and children could be could be at a certain level. In other words, it established a minimum wage for women and children in Washington, D.C. The Supreme Court ruled that that was unconstitutional under the Liberty of Contract Clause of the Constitution, saying that those women and those children had the right to freely contract with corporations at the wage that they wanted. And so a minimum wage was deemed to be completely unconstitutional for women and children. In another case in 1978, it's called Marshall v. Barlow, the Supreme Court, based upon the Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, ruled that OSHA inspectors had to be given notice before they entered a corporate premises to inspect for safety and health. Prior to that time, OSHA was able to go into a company from 1 minute to the next, and of course they found all sorts of violations. The Supreme Court said under search and seizure that a corporation has the right to be given 10 days notice. Of course, within 10 days they can clean up a lot of stuff and intimidate a lot of workers. And that's exactly what the intent was, and that's exactly what the practice has been. In terms of the issue of lifelong learning with reliable information or accurate information, there's a case that was decided. It's called International Dairy Foods versus Amistoy. This is a U.S. Supreme Court case in 1996, and it says that Vermont, even though it had passed a statute saying that it wanted Monsanto to actually label certain genetically modified dairy products, that it was unconstitutional. Monsanto sued and won, that it was unconstitutional because Monsanto had the negative First Amendment right not to label under the First Amendment. Freedom of speech not to label. So that was in 1976. And in fact, if Prop 37 had passed in California 2 years ago, which also had in it the requirement of actually labeling certain genetically modified products in California, and it barely lost because of tens of millions of dollars that came from out of state by Monsanto and other corporations like that. But it did lose. But if it had won, it undoubtedly would have been challenged in the Supreme Court, because in California, we also would not have the right to label, given the fact that corporations have the right not to label. And under the fourth area that I talked about, having a democratic decision-making structure in our lives, that's mostly what I'm going to talk about the rest of my speech, but the most egregious case clearly is Citizens United, which I think probably all of you are aware of. In January of 2010, the Supreme Court ruled that this nonprofit corporation, 501c4, Citizens United, could produce as many videos attacking Hillary Clinton as they wanted to, because corporations are people, and therefore they can give unlimited amounts of money to express themselves politically, and they can do this anonymously when it's with and through a nonprofit corporation. And so now, since 2010, we have unleashed the billionaires in the United States of America. We have unleashed the corporations, and I'll talk a little bit more later about what that means, but I think we all know that our elections really are auctions. They have nothing to do with being elections at this time. The last area, in terms of having enough free time to actually self-realize and have time to do those things that give us passion in life, in about 100 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to limit the work week to 60 hours. So there was a New York state law that limited the hours in the work week to 60 hours at that time, and the Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional, once again under the Liberty of Contract Clause of the United States Constitution, because if people want to work more than 60 hours, give them the right to do that. So this had nothing to do with time and a half overtime laws. This was just trying to limit what was later limited to the 40-hour work week to 60 hours in 1905. I'm just giving you examples of the power of the Supreme Court over the years, and I'm just giving you a number of cases. If you want to, we have actually created a one-page summary of 40 U.S. Supreme Court cases that deal with that have been decided on the legal theory of corporate personhood, and those are all available at the Santa Clara County Move to Amend website. It's called the Irate Project, because When I was in law school, if any attorneys are here, you learn how to IRAC cases. You look at the issue, the rule, the application of the rule, and then the conclusion for that case. Well, what we say is that in these cases of corporate personhood, the Supreme Court has an issue, a rule, an application of the rule, and then they have transformed the rule under this corporate personhood theory, and then we talk about what the effect is on everyday people. So we call this IRATE. This is our IRATE project instead of Iraq. So I'd like to move on and talk a little bit now about money and speech, and also the history of campaign finance in the United States, very briefly. There are a number of laws. The first one was the Tillman Act in 1907, and it prohibited federal contributions from nationally chartered corporations and banks. So banks and corporations at that time could not give contributions. President Teddy Roosevelt said at the time that the prohibition would be an effective method of stopping the evils aimed at in corrupt practice acts. In 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act actually extended that prohibition to labor unions. So it wasn't just corporations, but also labor unions that could not make those direct campaign contributions. In 1971, the very first finance law in the United States was passed that was relatively comprehensive. It was called the Federal Election Campaign Act, and it required, for the first time, the reporting of campaign contributions and expenditures. So up until 1971, it wasn't necessary. We all, under existing law in California and federal law, we know that contributions have to be recorded. Before 1971, they were not. And it also limited spending on media advertisements. But that law was ruled unconstitutional. And then I think a lot of you, like me, was around in 1972 when some burglars broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. That really changed a few things in the United States. For example, 2 years later, for the first time, under the Federal Election Campaign Act, an actual enforcement agency was developed. Up until 1974, there was no way to enforce any candidate, for example, who did not record their campaign expenditures or their campaign contributions. So the Federal Elections Commission, the FEC, was formed in 1974. Probably the seminal case with respect to money and speech is Buckley v. Vallejo. It did a number of things in 1976. This was a court that was heavily influenced by Lewis Powell. Lewis Powell in 1971 was the head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and he was appointed to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon. And in 1971, he basically put out a clarion call saying that we need to find ways to empower corporations. Corporations don't have enough power. And later he got onto the court, and he was very influential in Buckley v. Vallejo. In Buckley v. Vallejo, there were a number of findings by the Supreme Court. One was that it rejected the limits on expenditures. So all campaigns now can spend as much as they want. The Supreme Court said that they limit political expression at the core of our electoral process and of First Amendment freedoms. Secondly, it did uphold limits in terms of contributions to candidates. So as we know, under federal, state, county, local law, there are limits as to how much each individual can contribute to a candidate. Those are different amounts according to the level of the office. So those were ruled those limits on contributions were upheld as constitutional. In fact, what the Supreme Court said is they are the primary weapons against the reality or appearance of improper influence stemming from the dependence of candidates on large campaign contributions. Third, it allowed individual candidates to spend unlimited amounts of their own money. So any billionaire can spend their billions on their own campaign. And fourth, independent expenditures by individuals were permitted, but the spenders could not act in concert with a candidate. So you're probably familiar now that there are a number of 501c4s, 527s, different forms of campaign finance committees, and those are deemed to be independent expenditure committees. They cannot have direct linkage or communication with the candidate. And that's exactly what, for example, Citizens United was doing. So the absence of prearrangement or coordination of the expenditure with the candidate or his agent alleviates the danger that expenditures will be given as a quid pro quo for improper commitments from candidates. And finally, under Buckley v. Vallejo in 1976, corporations and labor unions were still banned from making independent expenditures. So in 1976, corporations and unions, because unions are also corporations, most of them are nonprofit corporations or legal entities, artificial entities. In 1976, from 1976 really up until the time of Citizens United, they could not make those independent expenditures. There was a new law in 2002. People call it the McCain-Feingold Bill. It's also called the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act. And basically, that law in 2002 attempted to close the loopholes of electioneering communications. So these are typically issue ads that help or hurt a candidate, but never use the words like elect or support. So they would bash somebody like Bernie Sanders in Vermont, but they would never say defeat Bernie Sanders, just that he's an evil guy. And for example, if you want to save the environment, call this number to complain about Bernie Sanders. In 2005 and 2006, there was a shift in the Supreme Court, and since then, we've had 7 deadly decisions for campaign finance in the United States. In 2005, now Chief Justice Roberts came onto the court, and in 2006, Alito joined the Supreme Court. And I want to talk briefly, not about all 7 of the cases, but about a few of them. So in 2008, in a case called Davis versus the Federal Elections Commission, the Supreme Court struck down what was called the Millionaires Amendment. This had allowed congressional candidates to raise larger contributions until they achieved parity with wealthy opponents who spent more than $350,000 of their own money. And as a result, I think from this, we know that the rich can continue to spend whatever they want. This was a challenge basically to the Buckley holding that an individual candidate cannot spend as much of their own money as they want, and the Supreme Court struck it down. And of course, in Citizens United, we saw in this holding, and you probably remember Obama at his speech, I think it was on January 21st, 2010, he looked straight into the eyes of Chief Justice Roberts and he said, "You screwed up by passing Citizens United." And Citizens United had just come down right before that 2010 speech by Obama. And what it means is that now corporations can give unlimited amounts of money to campaigns, as long as, quote unquote, they are not in cahoots or coordinated with the candidate or the campaign. In this case, Justice Kennedy stated that ingratiation and access are not corruption. And he said, "The appearance of influence or access, furthermore, will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy." So the fact that corporations can give unlimited amounts of money anonymously will not shake anybody's faith in our democracy, right? In another case in 2010 called SpeechNow.org, the District Court of Appeals, that is from Washington, D.C., using the same reasons of Citizens United, ruled that limits on individual contributions to groups that make independent expenditures are unconstitutional. So basically they said, if under Citizens United corporations can give unlimited amounts of money, why can't an individual do the same thing? And that's exactly what SpeechNow.org did in 2010, months after Citizens United was passed. So now not only corporations can give unlimited amounts of money, but anybody can give unlimited amounts of money to independent expenditure committees. In 2011, in a case called Arizona Free Enterprise Club, the Supreme Court struck down part of an Arizona law that provided public funds to candidates who agreed to raise only small contributions from the public and to abide by campaign finance expenditures. There were a number of states, believe it or not, Arizona had the best campaign finance laws in the United States of America as a state, because they basically said a candidate could go out and get $50 from 500 people, and then they would get matching funds. They showed that they had a base, and then they could get matching funds, and then they could get their message out statewide throughout all of Arizona. Because of that, women and minority representation increased exponentially in Arizona. For the first time, you really had women and minorities being much more involved in the process. And yet, what happens when you have a Citizens United? With a Citizens United, of course, if there are campaign finance rules in a state like Arizona, what does it matter when a billionaire can give, $10 million for an independent expenditure committee attacking the person that got those $550 contributions? It's a completely unlevel playing field. Then actually in 2012, in a case called American Tradition Partnership, in the state of Montana, they found that Citizens United was untenable, that it was really harming elections in Montana after 2 years. And so they took a course to the Supreme Court and lost. So the Supreme Court basically reaffirmed Citizens United and said that the Montana ban on corporate political spending was unconstitutional, that you could not ban you could not have limits on corporate contributions. And the final case, which I'm sure some of you have been familiar with in the last month or so, is the McCutcheon case. This is McCutcheon versus the Federal Election Commission, and in that case, the Supreme Court struck down aggregate contribution limits. So up until about a month ago, rich contributors could only contribute $123,000 over a 2-year cycle to the different, for example, Republican parties in all 50 states, to certain federal candidates like senators and members of the House of Representatives, and to the National Republican Party. So they were limited. They could only spend $123,000. The Supreme Court struck that down. This is actually the first time in the history of the United States that the Supreme Court has said that Congress cannot pass a law that limits contributions. Before, it said that Congress could create limits on contributions, and now for the first time in the history of the United States, a month ago, the Supreme Court says, we're going to strike down your $123,000 limit. As a result, the people, it's only a handful of people, well, hundreds of people that were actually reaching that limit of $123,000. Now, those hundreds of people, we have empowered the powerful and enriched the rich to be able to go out and spend about $8.6 million to those same entities. So now the rich are able to provide even more money to our campaigns, and I think as a result, you know where our democracy is going. So if you think about the meaning in particular of Citizens United, and you look at corporate profits, the profits of the 500 largest corporations of the United States are about $600 billion. If only 1% of the profits of those 500 corporations are spent on independent expenditures under Citizens United, 1% of the profits only, that would be $6 billion. In our last presidential campaign in the year 2012, the amount that was spent, which was outrageous at the time, was $2 billion. And so just 1% of corporate profits would completely overwhelm our political system. If they want to do it, they can, and it's only 1% of their profits. I think we know that elections have become an auction. Another example of that in terms of these contributions is the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers actually gave more in campaign contributions than all unions combined in 2012. So I want to talk a little bit about Move to Amend. As I mentioned, Move to Amend is a national movement to create a 28th Amendment. We know it's a long road. It's not easy to pass any amendment. We know that a lot of things will happen along the way. The We the People Amendment would basically outlaw corporate personhood, saying that only natural human beings are persons under the Constitution, and that we have the right to limit campaign contributions. And those are the two aspects of the We the People Amendment. There was a House joint resolution introduced on February 14th, 2013, about 15 months ago, to that effect. Move to Amend began about 5 years ago, actually before Citizens United. It's a grouping of national organizations that are working at a very grassroots level, as opposed to some of the other organizations that tend to sit in Washington, D.C. and send out emails and letters asking you for their money. Move to Amend has a number of brainstorming tours. The leadership of Move to Amend is constantly reaching out. We had a very good Move to Amend meeting right here in Palo Alto, right before Move to Amend Santa Clara County was formed in October 2.5 years ago. So there are a number of campaigns. There's a Pledge to Amend campaign where we're asking our elected representatives, especially at the state level, to support the 28th Amendment. Locally, we have a lot of elected officials and city councils, for example, that have passed resolutions. The Palo Alto City Council has passed a resolution opposing Citizens United, that is, money is speech, but has not yet taken a position on corporate personhood. The city of San Jose has done exactly the same thing. Los Altos Hills, Campbell, and Mountain View have all passed resolutions that state explicitly that corporations are not people and money is not speech. So they're supporting the full 28th Amendment. Right now, Palo Alto is still not on record saying that they believe corporate personhood is a problem. And we believe it is. Because actually, Citizens United was based upon corporate personhood. Citizens United was a nonprofit corporation, and that was the leverage for the Supreme Court to rule what it ruled. There's also other things that Move to Amend is involved in, is house parties. We're trying to gather 500,000 signatures by the end of the year. There's a Pledge to Resist McCutcheon campaign, and there's just ongoing local support of the 28th Amendment through resolutions and signature gathering. So in the United States, there are about 600 jurisdictions that have already taken a position against Citizens United and against corporations as people. That includes the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, the LA Board of Supervisors, and actually right now there is a bill before the state that still has not come out of committee, but it would basically do the same thing at the state level. It would require our elected officials at the state level, our senators and assembly people and the governor, to take a position on the 28th Amendment. I'd like to finally talk about our specific campaign. The name of the campaign is Build Democracy, End Corporate Rule. And we began last October with a kickoff with State Senator Jim Bell, who's been very supportive of this campaign, and David Cobb, who's the national spokesperson for Move to Amend. And we kicked off a campaign locally. What we found in doing research is that it's illegal to have a purely advisory vote by the people in almost any jurisdiction in California. It's not legal in San Jose, it's not legal in Palo Alto, it's not legal in Santa Clara County, it's not legal in the state of California. So you have to actually create a law or an ordinance other than a purely advisory vote on the 28th Amendment. And so what we added to the advisory vote was the creation of a democracy day. And so if this is approved by the voters in November, then the Board of Supervisors would be required to convene a democracy day and have a discussion about corporate personhood and in particular money as speech. We have collected thousands of signatures. We've got dozens and dozens of organizations, including your own, thank you very much, that are supporting our campaign. We have a long way to go and a very short time left. So I will ask you today, if you live in Santa Clara County, to please sign our petition if you have not. And I guess finally, I'd just like to thank you for allowing me to speak today. I think that we know that without democracy in our country, we're not going to get any of the reforms that we need in the United States of America. Personally, I believe that large corporations are controlling the Tea Party, and the Tea Party is controlling John Boehner and the Republican leadership of the House of Representatives. I've been working on immigration reform and labor law reform and healthcare reform, and honestly, the kind of healthcare reform we wanted didn't even get a hearing. Immigration reform is dead right now. Labor law reform never had a chance. And in terms of the environment, we're not going in a good direction in this country. So as long as corporations are controlling our candidates, and it really is a quid pro quo, even though the Supreme Court won't admit it, even as long as corporations are controlling our candidates, I honestly believe that we're going to continue with this gridlock, and we're never going to have the reforms that we need on behalf of people in this country. So I'd like to just conclude that I think we need to build a society and institutions that once again are democratic, are egalitarian, cooperative, sustainable, and kind. And in order to do that, we need to get big corporate money out of politics. So my understanding is some people may have some comments or questions, and my understanding also is that comments should be limited to like 2 minutes or so. So anybody, yes?
Now, hold on a second. Sandy's going to pick the order.
Okay.
We'll do it all very formally here. Get Sandy's attention or you won't be picked. And make sure you hold your hand up so she can see it. Also make sure you hold the mic close. Put it out here. It has to be close, okay? Otherwise people can't hear you and we can't record you. Okay, Sandy, who's the first person? Bob? Oh. Oh.
Thank you. That was an excellent speech.
Thank you.
I'm kind of concerned, I guess, about buzzwords or rallying cries. Money is not speech. To me, doesn't seem. I don't know if people would react to that. But I think what's going on in Congress is bribery. I mean, the rich and corporate lobbyists are basically bribed. It's called donations, but it amounts to bribery. And I think maybe the word bribery should be
Bribery
used
is not speech. I love it.
Yeah. And so, so I think we should. I would think the public might be outraged to think that Congress is being bribed all the time. They're called donations, but it's like a quid pro quo. So I think that's important. Also, I think another thing is when they talk about free speech, it's not free speech, it's expensive speech. You know, I'm not free. Yeah, I'm free to buy. I'm free to go on national television and say what I want if I can pay for it. It's free if you can pay for it. It's an oxymoron. So I think that maybe that should be used as a part of the message.
Those are great points. I really appreciate that. You know, I was at an interview, and the person interviewing me on the radio station was a libertarian, and he had his best friend there who was also a libertarian. And they were supporting the notion that if you're a billionaire, you should be allowed to spend all of your money on a campaign. And I knew that both of them were very low income. And I said, what do you think your $50 that you might contribute would mean when a billionaire can contribute, you know, $15 million with no sweat? And I think they got the point, that we are limiting our free speech rights by allowing large corporations and billionaires to spend however much they want to spend. So I really appreciate your point.
I was just wondering, could the Supreme Court at any time just rule that corporations are not people? And, you know, especially if it was just inserted by some clerk or something, and, you know, if Scalia retired and some liberal judge was appointed to replace him, could the Supreme Court just get rid of that on their own? And has there been any attempt to do that when the court was more liberal in the past?
There has been no attempt, but I don't believe that anybody believes that the Supreme Court would overrule dozens and dozens and dozens of cases that it's already ruled on. A lot of people believe that all we need is somebody to die and somebody to replace them, and that Obama appoints them and we're home free, you know, for the Citizens United, you know, type of ruling will be overturned. Honestly, I don't believe too many people believe that that will institutionally create a level playing field over time for the vast majority of people in the United States. We want a democracy that's for the people, and we can't assume that a 5-4 majority that's shifting back and forth over a number of decades is going to assure that equilibrium and democracy that we deserve as people, you know, in this country.
Yes, I'm kind of hoping that Ruth Bader Ginsburg does the right thing and retires this year so that Obama can replace her with a young liberal. Not that I have any problem with the way she's ruling, it's just that she's, you know, old and sick, and it would be a shame if a Republican were elected president in 2016 and she were replaced by another Alito. But I guess we're going to have to inspire, you know, there's some good billionaires out there, so it's, you know, good billionaires versus bad billionaires, you know, and maybe, you know, I really don't feel like we have a democracy anymore, but if the Democrats can hang on in 2016 and they can appoint replacements for the aging conservatives, you know, in the next, you know, 2016 to 2020 or 24, that we have a chance. If a Republican gets elected in 2016, I think we're screwed.
Let me just make one comment. This is what I personally believe, that this whole frame of allowing corporations and the very rich to control our democracy has moved the Democratic Party to the right also. So we really have a two-party system, and the entire framework has moved to the right, in my opinion. And in large part, it is because of this requirement of campaign contributions. Obama has to compete with the candidate for the Republican Party. How do you compete unless you yourself go out and outraise or raise a similar amount of money from corporations and from the wealthy? And are you beholden? You better believe it. I believe that the Democratic Party also is beholden, and that some of those reforms that we would like to see are simply not going to happen until we break this deadlock that we have. Because I give as an example immigration reform, because I've been working on immigration reform since 1986, when the last reform was passed. And in 1986, it was passed under a conservative Republican president, Ronald Reagan. And that was the last time that people who have been undocumented since before 1982 have had a line to stand in to ever get legal status. Now, here we are in 2014, and the type of reforms that are being talked about are reforms where people might get work authorization but would never get a path to citizenship, because Latinos, if they got citizenship, would vote Democrat, and we're going to block that at all costs. And so everything has become a political football, and some of the reforms that would make sense to allow 11 million people to have full human dignity in the United States of America are simply not going to happen under our current framework, in my opinion.
If you were successful and got a constitutional amendment passed, couldn't the Supreme Court just declare that illegal at some point before it actually happened?
They have never declared a constitutional amendment illegal. They can't do that to They can't declare the Bill of Rights, for example, unconstitutional. In the last constitutional amendment that was passed actually was passed in the space of 3 months. And that was the constitutional amendment that said, if you're 18 years old and you can die in Vietnam, then we're going to also give you the right to vote in the United States of America. And so 18-year-olds were given the right to vote. There was unanimous consensus, and it just went through, boom, in 3 months. We don't have that kind of consensus now around the 28th Amendment, because clearly corporations are going to block every attempt possible for a 28th Amendment. I view this as a very long political struggle where we're going to have to corner elected officials, and they're either with us or they're against us on this. But honestly, until we get a more of a level playing field around campaign finance, I think people are waking up that we're not going to get the reforms that we need in this country.
Don't I remember sometime in the past when the Federal Communications Commission had some kind of equal time thing where if all the political candidates would get equal time on the public media? And what happened with that?
I don't know specifically what happened to that, but I can tell you one very similar case, and the name of the case is called PG&E. And so in this case of PG&E versus the Public Utilities Commission, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that a utility commission regulation, in the case of PG&E, they had a regulation that required private utility companies to include in its billing envelopes materials by a public interest group, for example, around conservation. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to require that kind of information inside a billing envelope that would help people, for example, save water or save electricity. And so I'm assuming that it's on those same grounds that I'm not familiar exactly what happened, but I know you're correct.
What can be done about the tremendous amount of money that is used by lobbyists to bribe congressmen to vote one way or the other? I mean, we've really lost our democracy since they're only listening to people who are giving them money.
About 3 weeks ago, right after Hillary Clinton spoke at San Jose State, we had a fundraiser for Build Democracy, End Corporate Rule, and Sally Lieber spoke. And I'm sure a lot of you know Sally Lieber. And she was the pro temp in the Assembly for many years. And she explained that as Assembly pro temp, every Democrat in the Assembly had to work at least 2 hours a day to raise money, every single day of their life. And every Wednesday, they got together in a room like this, and they said, how much have you raised this week? And every single Democrat had to demonstrate that they had raised X amount of money. And their committee assignments depended upon how much they raised. And their influence as Assembly people or as senators depended upon how much money they raised. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but clearly we have a situation that's untenable throughout the United States. It's similar throughout. One example of lobbyists that she said was a lobbyist that came up to her and asked for 30 seconds of her time. And he handed her a card and said, call this number if you're going to attend our fundraiser, knowing that if she attended that fundraiser, she would get $25,000 in campaign contributions to a third-party expenditure committee, and that she would support their bill. That's how things are working in Sacramento. And I believe that's how things are working in Washington.
Okay, we don't have any. I have a question if somebody else doesn't have one.
Oh, thank you. Well, to echo what you had said on it not all being up to the Supreme Court, I think that's an important thing to matter. I realize there's some political bias in some of the judges, but those people are in their positions not to decide what is best for the country. They're in their position to decide, and ethically bound to decide what they think matches the existing laws. That is all. And so when Chief Justice Roberts shakes his head at Obama's finger wag, he's not saying, no, I was right, this is a good thing to do. He's saying, no, I was right. The Constitution says this is what I should have voted. And this country is in need of reforms for the corporations, and we need to act legislatively and get national amendments to stop the commodization of human life and the overdominance of just blatant money sources for controlling what is human life. And I wonder in that regard if it might be more constructive not to simply say what we're trying to do is not say that corporations are equal people, but to say that they are, to put in the language, so there's no question about it, that the corporation is a serf to the people. It is subsidiary to the people. It works for the people, to leave the room open for the restructuring that this nation is going to take in order for the people, to see that corporations do provide jobs, that it's not just people being thrown out to die on the streets.
I believe that's the theory, but not the practice of corporations. As was mentioned, since 1811, corporations have been able to charter in perpetuity and pretty much change the laws at will to favor themselves.
So, we are nurturing, the U.S. government is providing money to GM. It is bailing out financial corporations. It is being supported and surviving from the people. It is not behaving as an individual, and it is subject to the people so that we can structure our nation around it. If these corporations are going to be under the protection of the U.S. government, I think a language in the amendments that essentially go national say as much, so that there is never any question that they're not just cut loose as entities, as even freely surviving entities. In other words, it's not a matter of just saying they're not people. It's a matter of saying that a corporation is essentially a serf to the people. And something in the language like that would be more constructive to the direction I think we want to take.
Let me actually read you the language of move to amend. And it's very short. The rights protected by the Constitution of the United States are the rights of natural persons only. Artificial entities established by the laws of any state, the United States, or any foreign state shall have no rights under this Constitution and are subject to regulation by the people through federal, state, and local law. The privileges of artificial entities shall be determined by the people. So corporations serve the people, they get the privilege to serve the people, and they cannot be overturned by an unelected Supreme Court. Through our elected representatives, corporations have the privilege to receive certain rights, but not through the rulings of an unelected Supreme Court. So basically, I think we're in agreement. I tried to shorten things by saying corporations are not persons, but actually the language is very similar to what you're saying.
I was going to throw in a question. I'm just curious. This is about the fourth time I've heard a presentation from your group. The only thing I didn't notice is I don't know what your strategy, long-term strategy is. I just didn't hear it. In other words, first A, then B, then C over time, other than, I don't know what, doing whatever you think comes naturally at the next step. That's not my interpretation. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, we're trying to build a grassroots movement around the United States. I have to say, when I was at the Hillary Clinton speech 2.5 weeks ago, there were 5,000 people there to hear Hillary Clinton, and I was talking to groups of 5 and 10 people about Citizens United, and I believe less than 20% of the people even knew about Citizens United. So it's just amazing how little people really know. So at this point, we're really engaged in a broad educational campaign, a grassroots educational campaign. And we want to pass as many resolutions and have as many people confronted with the issue of money as speech and corporations as persons. That's why we're trying to get this November ballot measure on in Santa Clara County, so that people for the first time will have to say, what the heck is that? Because they have no idea. The vast majority of people have no idea. And so in the long run, through that education and through gaining power through resolutions and through ballot measures in different states, we want to get 3/4 of the state legislatures to support, and of course 2/3 of Congress to introduce. And we know that's an uphill battle at this time, but we also don't see any other option. If I saw a better option, I would be doing that option. But I honestly don't see anything short of a constitutional amendment really changing the frame of money as speech and corporations as persons.
Perhaps Carl asked my question in another form. I wanted, before you leave the podium, to suggest 2 or 3 specific, very concrete things that each of us could do in the next few days that would move this campaign forward.
Number 1, sign the petition today if you're a resident of Santa Clara County. And where are the petitions? Have they gone around? Oh, they're underneath. Okay. Can anybody take one and start passing them around? That's very concrete. But you do need to be a registered voter in Santa Clara County. Secondly, if anybody would like to help gather signatures in the next couple of weeks, please take petitions with you. I have a sign-in for anybody who would like to take a number of petitions and try to get them back to our office in the next couple of weeks. Third, we have a resolutions work group that is working to get resolutions passed in different cities throughout the peninsula. We still want to go back to the Palo Alto City Council, so you could help us go back and get that full measure from them. We also want to reach out and get elected officials, so you can meet with your elected official and ask them to sign on to the Move to Amend 28th Amendment. Those are some very concrete things. We also have an education work group that is going out to different organizations, like to this organization, and to unions and to community organizations, to universities, and talking about the importance of this project in the long run. So those are some concrete things. And if you don't have my contact information, I can give that to you. Anybody here? My name is Richard Hobbs, and my email is richhobbs@msn.com. richhobbs@msn.com. My cell phone is 408-460-2999. And if you didn't get that, just come up to me after the meeting and I'll give it to you, and we can connect you in. And there is a working group in Palo Alto, so we can connect you to a working group if you want to do work in Palo Alto. Yes.
Question and a comment. The question is, if we suspect we've signed this petition before, do we go ahead and sign again, or does it matter?
If you're not sure, then go ahead and sign it. Okay. We're expecting a repeat rate.
Okay. And the comment is, all of this unlimited campaign spending goes to the media that produce and distribute campaign messages. And so it's unlikely people are going to hear much about it from the media or hear anything but negative things from the media. Do you have a plan to deal with that?
Well, I think the Disclose Act would help if the top 3 donors to each one of those messages had to be named in an ad, either a print ad or a broadcast media ad. I think that would go a long way, because if you hear that the top donor is Monsanto, you probably have an opinion about that ad. And so I think the Disclose Act that I hope all of you are supporting, I know you are, there's a petition on the table for the Disclose Act. I think that will be one example of a big help.